Alrighty, so here's some more excerpts out of Decision Points by G.W. Bush. We're starting on page 154. In late September, FBI Director Bob Mueller inserted a big tile when he told me there were 331 potential al-Qaeda operatives inside the United States. Okay. Now, what I'm doing here is I want to show you how things were framed and propped up. So, on 9/11, it was obvious that law enforcement approach to terrorism had failed. Suicidal men willing to fly passenger planes into buildings were not common criminals. They could not be deterred by the threat of prosecution. The 1993 World Trade Center bombing, the Timothy McVeigh, they were prosecuted in court. So they decided after 9/11 that terrorists like this were not ordinary fertilizer flingers. My authority to conduct the war on terror came from two sources. One was Article 2 of the Constitution, which entrusts the President with wartime powers as Commander-in-Chief. The other was a congressional war resolution passed 3 days after 9/11 by a vote of 98-0 in the Senate and 420-1 in the House. The Congress declared that the President is authorized to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11, 2001, or harbored such organizations or persons in order to prevent any future acts of international terrorism against the United States by such nations, organizations, or persons. Alrighty. So, Bush also acknowledges that he says, I was also keenly aware that presidents had a history of overreaching during war. John Adams had signed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which banned public dissent. Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus during the Civil War. Franklin Roosevelt ordered Japanese Americans interned during World War II. But Bush says his thing was to protect Americans. So, he approved the deployment of National Guard forces to airports, put more air marshals on the plane, required airlines to harden cockpit doors. This is where we got the TSA from, basically. Here we go on down, and the Department of Homeland Security ends up being created. They figure out that it's kind of hard having all of these different agencies that are responsible for everything, but they don't communicate well to each other, and they're all under separate roofs. So here we go into Democratic Senator Joe Lieberman of Connecticut, basically pitching the idea of the Department of Homeland Security. And Bush wasn't so hip about rearranging things, but then he came across a successful precedent for restructuring the government in wartime. And in 1947, President Harry Truman had consolidated the Navy and War Departments into the new Department of Defense. So with that in mind, the bill was proposed, and the Democrats held up the legislation by insisting that the new department grant its employees extensive collective bargaining rights that did not apply to any other government agency. And Bush says, I was frustrated that the Democrats would delay an urgent security measure to placate labor unions. So, the Department of Homeland Security, for what it's supposed to be doing, it's called the Department of Homeland Security, and the Democrats were delaying Homeland Security for labor unions. Okay, so this is President Bush's words, not mine. So he was in office. I've never been president, so I'm assuming that he might have been able to document and archive the things that actually happened during his administration. But, you know, that's just what books are for. The only other president to pick up seats in both the House and Senate in his first midterm election was Franklin Roosevelt. And then Tom Ridge becomes the head of the Department of Homeland Security. Now we go in a little bit further and come October 2nd, 2001. There ended up being a bunch of anthrax. You can see this here, that there was a threat and whatnot. And then there's a bunch of assessments that were done for scenario's sake, for just in case purposes to plan for, in case there was bioweapons release of some sort, either in the air or, well, they didn't specify the air, but they did specify possibly a subway. So, and we come on down. And they don't know where the anthrax came from that was hitting people. 5 out of 17 people ended up dying because of it. One of the best intelligence services in Europe, says George Bush, told us it suspected Iraq. Saddam Hussein's regime was one of few in the world with a record of using weapons of mass destruction. It had acknowledged possession of anthrax in 1995. Others suspected that Al-Qaeda was involved. So, down here, in 2010, after exhaustive investigation, the Justice Department and FBI concluded Dr. Bruce Ivins, a U.S. government scientist who committed suicide in 2008, had executed the anthrax attack alone. So right there, we're just kind of saying there were no weapons of mass destruction from Saddam Hussein, because we were suspecting that the anthrax was said weapons of mass destruction. Someone in Europe said, oh, by the way, we think this, and yeah, that's interesting. But just wait until you find out who was involved in all of this part with Dr. Bruce Irvin. All right, so we go ahead and skip on over, because there's some people that are critics saying that the situation had been inflated or manipulated for political gain. Political benefit, excuse me. Then we've got George Tenet running in. This is the worst we've seen it since 9/11, Tenet said in a grave voice as he pulled out his half-chewed cigar, at a late October intelligence briefing. He cited a highly reliable source warning there would be another attack on either October 30th or 31st that was bigger than the World Trade Center. Okay, and then President Bush, at the time, acknowledges after several false alarms. Now, mind you, they've been relying on the intelligence that's been aforementioned. And so, since we've got this threat that might be credible, they go ahead and pack Cheney off to the undisclosed location for continuity of government, and Bush starts arguing with the Secret Service as to whether or not he's going to stay in Washington, D.C. And then we find out that there was this information wall. And I quote, "One major gap in our counterterrorism capabilities was what many called the wall. Over time, the government had adopted a set of procedures that prevented law enforcement and intelligence personnel from sharing key information." And Bush says, "We've got to fix the problem." Attorney General John Ashcroft took the lead in writing the legislative proposal. The result was the U.S. Patriot Act. Just for everybody's awareness, the U.S. Patriot Act, here's the meaning of the name. Congress named the law uniting and strengthening America by providing appropriate tools ready to intercept and obstruct terrorism act. And so the Patriot Act eliminated that information wall. and allowed the personnel to share information, modernized our counterterrorism capabilities by giving investigators access to tools like, you'll love this one, quote, roving wiretaps, which allowed them to track suspects who changed cell phones or cell phone numbers, an authority that had long been used to catch drug traffickers and mob bosses. I authorized aggressive financial measures to freeze terrorist assets, and it included judicial and congressional oversight to protect civil liberties. One provision created a little discomfort at home. The Patriot Act allowed the government to seek warrants and examine the business records of suspected terrorists, such as credit card receipts, apartment leases, and library records. Library records played a role in several high-profile cases, such as the Zodiac gunman murders in California. The last thing I wanted was to allow the freedom and access to information provided by American libraries to be utilized against us by Al-Qaeda. So that's where, when people talk about going into bookstores and stuff, saying that it's being cataloged, what you're getting, and this right here would be why. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's that they do catalog these things, and too many of the wrong type of thing, and you're going to get labeled. Alrighty, so continuing on. Over the next 5 years, the Patriot Act helped us break up potential terror cells in New York, Oregon, Virginia, and Florida. In one example, law enforcement and intelligence authorities shared information that led to the arrest of 6 Yemeni Americans in Lackawanna, New York, who had traveled to a terrorist training camp in Afghanistan and met with Osama bin Laden. And they pled guilty. We're going to continue on here. And the freshness of 9/11 faded. So did the overwhelming congressional support for the Patriot Act. Civil liberties advocates and commentators on the wings of both parties mischaracterized the law as to stand for everything they disliked about the war on terror. Key provisions of the Patriot Act, such as the authority to conduct roving wiretaps, were set to expire in 2005. I pushed hard for their reauthorization, as I told Congress the threat had not expired, so the law shouldn't either. Now, just to let you know, that part there, the roving wiretaps, that has to be reauthorized every 5 years. There's parts of the Patriot Act that actually have to be reauthorized by our Congress, and this thing has been in activity since 2001. So how long have these congressional members been not changing things and just continuing on with status quo? Just saying. Lawmakers delayed and complained, but when they finally did vote, they renewed the Patriot Act by a margin of 89-10 in the Senate and 251-174 in the House. In early 2010, key provisions of the Patriot Act were authorized again by the heavily Democratic Congress in 2010. My one regret about the Patriot Act is its name. When my administration sent the bill to Capitol Hill, it was initially called the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2001. Congress got clever and renamed it. As a result, there was an implication that people who opposed the law were unpatriotic. That was not what I intended. I should have pushed Congress to change the name of the bill before I signed it. Yeah, well, he didn't, and now because of that, there are plenty of people that are basically lumped up into that category because the politicians and the political followers use the language that is that wound up being signed into law. So, Here President Bush goes over how they figured out how two of the hijackers were in contact with Al-Qaeda leaders overseas more than a dozen times. And Bush wanted to know why weren't the calls actually intercepted. The man with the answers was Mike Hayden, a 3-star Air Force general who led the National Security Agency. If the intelligence community is the brains of the national security, the NSA is part of the gray matter. The agency is filled with smart, techno-savvy experts and code breakers, along with analysts and linguists. Mike told me the NSA had the capability to monitor those Al-Qaeda phone calls into the United States before 9/11, but he didn't have the legal authority to do it without receiving a court order, a process that could be difficult and slow. The reason was a law called the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, written in 1978, before widespread use of cell phones and the internet. FISA prohibited the NSA from monitoring communications involving people inside the United States without a warrant from the FISA court. For example, if a terrorist in Afghanistan contacted a terrorist in Pakistan, NSA could intercept their conversations. But if the same terrorist called someone in the United States or sent an email that touched an American computer server, NSA had to apply for a court order. That made no sense to Bush. Why would it be tougher to monitor Al-Qaeda communications with terrorists inside the United States than with their associates overseas? Mike Hayden put it, we're flying blind with no early warning system. After 9/11, we couldn't afford to fly blind. If Al-Qaeda operatives were calling into or out of the United States, we damn sure needed to know who they were calling and what they were saying. And given the urgency of the threats, we could not allow ourselves to be bogged down in court approval process. I asked the White House counsel's office and the Justice Department to study whether I could authorize the NSA to monitor Al-Qaeda communications into and out of the country without FISA warrants. Both told me I could. They concluded that conducting surveillance against our enemies in war fell within the authorities granted by the Congressional War Resolution and the constitutional authority of the Commander-in-Chief. Abraham Lincoln had wiretapped telegraph machines during the Civil War. Woodrow Wilson had ordered the interception of virtually every telephone and telegraph message going into or out of the United States during World War I. Franklin Roosevelt had allowed the military to read and censor communications during World War II. Bush wanted to ensure safeguards to prevent abuses. That's nice. I gave the order to proceed with the program. We considered going to Congress to get legislation, but key members from both parties who received highly classified briefings on the program agreed that the surveillance was necessary and the legislative debate was not possible without exposing our methods to the enemy. Their methods were spying on American everything. So, big secret. On December 22nd, a British passenger named Richard Reed tried to blow up an American Airlines flight carrying 197 people from Paris to Miami by detonating explosives in his shoes. Okay, so this part is where the TSA comes in, and that's why you have to take off your shoes now. So, here we come down to when Richard Reed was arrested. He was swiftly placed into the U.S. criminal justice system, which entitled him to the same constitutional protections as a common criminal. But the shoe bomber was not a burglar or a bank robber. He was a foot soldier in al-Qaeda's war against America. He had emailed his mother 2 days before his attempted attack. Why I am doing this is part of the ongoing war between Islam and disbelief. By giving this terrorist the right to remain silent, we deprived ourselves of the opportunity to collect vital intelligence on his plan and his handlers. Sorry, I was a little off there. Reed's case made it clear that we needed a new policy for dealing with captured terrorists. In this new kind of war, there was no more valuable source of intelligence on potential attacks than terrorists themselves. Amid the steady stream of threats after 9/11, I grappled with 3 of the most critical decisions I would make in the war on terror: where to hold captured enemy fighters, how to determine their legal status and ensure they eventually face justice, and how to learn what they knew about future attacks so we could protect the American people. So this is where CIA officers went to interrogate Taliban and al-Qaeda prisoners detained at a primitive 19th century Afghan fortress. I'm not going to pronounce that. A riot ensued. All right. Using weapons smuggled into the complex, enemy fighters killed one of our officers, Johnny Mike Spann, making him the first American combat death in this war, or in the war. The tragedy highlighted a need for a secure facility to hold captured terrorists. We held al-Qaeda detainees on Navy ships in the Arabian Sea, but that was not a viable long-term solution. We could send the terrorists to a secure base on a distant island or U.S. territory such as Guam, but holding captured terrorists on American soil could activate constitutional protections they would not otherwise receive, such as a right to remain silent, that would make it much more difficult to get urgently needed intelligence. We decided to hold detainees at a remote naval station on the southern tip of Cuba, Guantanamo Bay. The base was on Cuban soil, but the United States controlled it under a lease acquired after the Spanish-American War. The Justice Department advised me that prisoners brought there had no right of access to U.S. criminal justice system. The area surrounding Guantanamo was inaccessible and sparsely populated. Holding terrorists in Fidel Castro's Cuba was hardly an appealing prospect, but as Don Rumsfeld put it, Guantanamo was the least worst choice available. So there's who can go to Guantanamo. And what the effect of going to Guantanamo does, you have no constitutional rights once you're there. On November 13th, I signed an executive order establishing military tribunals to try captured terrorists. So on November 13th, 2001, an executive order was signed by G.W. Bush establishing military tribunals to try captured terrorists. The system was based closely on the one that created by FDR in 1942, which tried and convicted 8 Nazi spies who had infiltrated the United States. The Supreme Court had unanimously upheld the legality of those tribunals. I was confident the military tribunals would provide a fair trial. Detainees were entitled to the presumption of innocence, representation by a qualified attorney, and the right to present evidence that would have probative value to the reasonable person. For For practical national security reasons, they were not allowed to view classified information that would expose intelligence sources and methods. Convicting a defendant required an agreement of 2/3 of the tribunal. The detainee could appeal the tribunal decisions or sentence to the Secretary of Defense and to the President. Inherent to my tribunal's decision and many others in the new war was tension between protecting American people and upholding civil liberties. Maintaining our values was critical to our position in the world. We could neither lead the free world nor recruit new allies to our cause if we did not practice what we preached. I believed military tribunals struck the right balance, upholding the rule of law while protecting the country. Okay, so there's more, but this is already 26 minutes in. My tongue is going numb. My mouth is dry. I'm stuttering. I'm stumbling. But I wanted to get this out to folks. So there's where, excuse me, military tribunals can come into effect. That's when the executive order was established. I've not heard of that executive order ever being repealed, and now Donald Trump is in office. So there you go. Have a great day, folks.